The Cold War wasn't just a political standoff. It was a 40-year game of nuclear brinkmanship that brought the world to the edge of destruction. Did you know humanity came within minutes of annihilation? Not once, but multiple times? From the Cuban Missile Crisis, where leaders played a high-stakes game of who blinks first, to terrifying moments like the 1983 Soviet nuclear false alarm caused by a faulty computer chip, the threat of global catastrophe was constant. One of the most chilling examples? On October 27, 1962, a Soviet submarine, kept charged by U.S. forces and cut off from Moscow, believed World War III had begun. The crew voted to launch a nuclear torpedo, but one man, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. His decision saved millions of lives. This is the story of how the Cold War almost ended the world, and how humanity narrowly escaped disaster, time and time again. Imagine a world where one wrong move could have ended everything. Leaders like Joseph Stalin, Harry Truman, Nikita Khrushchev, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, and Mikhail Gorbachev held the fate of humanity in their hands. From nuclear standoffs to secret negotiations, the Cold War was a high-stakes game that brought the world to the edge of destruction. And somehow, we survived. This is the story of how the world almost ended. Picture a world divided into two superpowers, the USA and the USSR, each backed by powerful allies and organizations like NATO, the Warsaw Pact, the CIA, the KGB, and the United Nations. For over 40 years, these giants faced off in a dangerous game of spies, nuclear weapons, and global power struggles. This is the story of the Cold War, how the world came closer to ending than ever before, and how we narrowly avoided disaster. Key decision-makers during the Cold War included prominent leaders from both the United States and the Soviet Union, whose policies and actions significantly influenced the course of this geopolitical conflict. United States leaders. Harry S. Truman, 1945 to 1953. Truman was pivotal in establishing the U.S. policy of containment aimed at restricting Soviet expansion. His administration introduced the Truman Doctrine, which committed the U.S. to support countries threatened by communism, laying the groundwork for Cold War Strategy 24. Dwight D. Eisenhower, 1953 to 1961. Eisenhower's presidency was marked by a shift towards nuclear deterrence and a strategy known as massive retaliation. His administration sought to maintain military strength while reducing conventional forces, thus emphasizing nuclear capabilities as a deterrent against Soviet aggression. 23. John F. Kennedy, 1961 to 1963. Kennedy's leadership included critical moments, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the U.S. and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war. His administration focused on both military preparedness and diplomatic engagement with the Soviets. 5. Ronald Reagan, 1981 to 1989. Reagan's approach combined a strong military buildup with efforts to engage in dialogue with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. His administration's policies, particularly regarding nuclear arms reduction, played a significant role in de-escalating tensions towards the end of the Cold War. 13. Soviet leaders. Joseph Stalin, 1924 to 1953. Stalin's policies shaped early Cold War dynamics through aggressive expansionism and repression within Eastern Europe. His death in 1953 marked a significant turning point in Soviet politics and strategy. 2. Nikita Khrushchev, 1953 to 1964. Khrushchev's leadership was characterized by attempts at de-Stalinization and a more open approach to diplomacy, exemplified by his visit to the U.S. in 1959. He also played a crucial role during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he sought to assert Soviet power, but ultimately retreated under U.S. pressure. 25. Mikhail Gorbachev, 1985 to 1991. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring were instrumental in reforming the Soviet Union and reducing Cold War tensions. His willingness to engage with Reagan led to significant arms reduction agreements and ultimately contributed to the end of the Cold War. 16. These leaders, through their decisions and interactions, shaped the geopolitical landscape of the Cold War era, influencing both military strategies and diplomatic relations between their nations. During the Cold War, tensions were often escalated by leaders like Joseph Stalin, who expanded Soviet control, and Nikita Khrushchev, who provoked crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis. On the other side, U.S. presidents like Harry Truman and John F. Kennedy pushed back with policies like containment and military buildups. But there were also leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan who worked to de-escalate tensions through diplomacy, arms control agreements, and ending the arms race. In the end, it was a mix of tough actions and peaceful negotiations that shaped the course of the Cold War. Proxy wars are conflicts where major powers support smaller groups or countries to fight on their behalf, rather than engaging directly. This led to significant suffering for civilians in the affected regions. Notable proxy wars and their victims. Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. The war resulted in about 3.8 million deaths, mostly among Vietnamese civilians and soldiers. The U.S. supported South Vietnam against the North, which was backed by the Soviet Union and China 23. Soviet-Afghan War, 1979 to 1989. Over 1 million Afghans died during this conflict, with many more displaced. The U.S. supported Afghan fighters, Mujahideen, against the Soviet invasion, leading to widespread destruction. 13. Yemen Civil War, 2014 present. This ongoing conflict has resulted in over 377,000 deaths by early 2022, with millions suffering from famine and displacement due to foreign involvement from Saudi Arabia and Iran. 12. Syrian Civil War, 2011 present. Since the start of the war, more than 500,000 people have died, with millions displaced as various countries support different factions in the conflict. 12. Iraq conflict, 2003 present. Nearly 500,000 deaths have been reported since the U.S.-led invasion in 2003, with many civilians caught in the crossfire between different armed groups supported by foreign powers. 12. Nuclear threats. The threat of nuclear war during the Cold War also created victims, as fear and tension affected many lives. Civilians lived under constant fear of nuclear attacks, especially during crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Many countries prepared for potential nuclear fallout, leading to widespread anxiety and disruption of daily life. Several critical moments during the Cold War brought the world very close to nuclear war. Here are the most significant ones. The Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962, marked the Cold War's most perilous moment when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, prompting a U.S. naval blockade and a 13-day standoff. The crisis ended with the Soviets removing missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and the secret removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. Berlin Crisis, 1961. Saw the construction of the Berlin Wall, escalating tensions between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and raising fears of nuclear war. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, pitted North Korea, backed by China and the USSR, against South Korea, supported by the U.S., with fears of nuclear escalation after China's involvement. The Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, heightened Cold War tensions as the U.S. feared communist expansion, risking nuclear conflict with China and the USSR. Finally, Able Archer 83, 1983, nearly triggered nuclear war when the USSR misinterpreted a NATO exercise as a real attack, leading to Soviet preparations for retaliation. These events underscored the constant threat of nuclear escalation during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union played a high-stakes game of global chess, each using bold strategies to outmaneuver the other. The U.S. focused on containment, aiming to stop communism spread by backing anti-communist regimes with money, weapons, and political muscle. They also embraced brinkmanship, pushing conflicts like the Cuban Missile Crisis to the edge of nuclear war to force the Soviets to blink. To avoid all-out nuclear destruction, the U.S. adopted flexible response, building up conventional forces and special ops for smaller conflicts. Later, détente brought a thaw in tensions, with arms control treaties like SALT cooling the nuclear arms race. On the other side, the Soviets pursued expansionism, spreading communism worldwide by supporting revolutions and governments in places like Eastern Europe and Africa. They poured resources into a massive military buildup, amassing nuclear and conventional forces to intimidate the U.S. and its allies. Through propaganda, they waged a war of ideas, promoting communism and slamming capitalism via media and cultural exchanges. Finally, they actively countered U.S. influence, backing insurgent groups in Vietnam and Afghanistan to weaken American-backed regimes. These strategies turned the Cold War into a global showdown of ideologies, power, and nerve. The Cold War left a dramatic and lasting impact on the world, shaping lives and nations in profound ways. Loss of life and suffering were staggering, with proxy wars like Vietnam and Afghanistan claiming millions of lives and leaving civilians trapped in cycles of violence and poverty. Political changes reshaped entire regions. Soviet interventions in Hungary and Czechoslovakia crushed democratic hopes, while the U.S. often propped up authoritarian regimes to counter communism, ignoring human rights abuses. The nuclear arms race fueled global anxiety, as the U.S. and USSR amassed enough weapons to destroy the planet, leaving people living under the shadow of annihilation. Economically, the Cold War drained resources, with nations prioritizing military spending over social programs, especially in Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe, where inefficiencies led to lower living standards. Global alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact divided the world into rival camps, heightening tensions. Culturally, propaganda wars fueled stereotypes, while the space race sparked technological leaps, but also deepened national rivalries. Finally, the Cold War accelerated decolonization, as superpowers vied for influence in newly independent nations, often sparking further conflicts. From fear to innovation, the Cold War's legacy is a complex tapestry of human struggle and ambition. The Cold War ignited shortly after World War II, around 1945, as tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union flared during the Potsdam Conference, where clashing ideologies, capitalism versus communism, took center stage. This high-stakes rivalry lasted for decades, shaping global politics, until it finally came to an end in 1991 with the dramatic collapse of the Soviet Union. The fall of the USSR not only dissolved communist control in Eastern Europe, but also marked the close of a tense, world-altering era. The Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962, was the Cold War's most nail-biting moment, as the U.S. discovered Soviet nuclear missiles just 90 miles from its shores. For 13 tense days, the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war, but both sides stepped back, agreeing to remove their missiles. During the crisis, the Soviet submarine incident, October 27, 1962, nearly sparked disaster when a Soviet sub, surrounded by U.S. ships, almost launched a nuclear torpedo until Officer Vasily Arkhipov's refusal saved the day. Years later, Able Archer 83, November 1983, saw NATO's nuclear war simulation misread by the Soviets as a real attack, pushing them to high alert and bringing the world terrifyingly close to conflict. Finally, the Norwegian rocket incident, January 25, 1995, almost triggered nuclear war again when Russia mistook a research rocket for a U.S. missile, but cooler heads prevailed. These moments highlight how close the world came to catastrophe during the Cold War. The Cold War turned several global hotspots into explosive battlegrounds between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Cuba became the epicenter of the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. A 13-day nuclear standoff that brought the world to the brink of destruction. Berlin was a constant flashpoint, from the Berlin blockade, 1948 to 1949, to the construction of the Berlin Wall, 1961, where U.S. and Soviet tanks faced off at Checkpoint Charlie. In Korea, the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, saw North and South Korea, backed by the superpowers, clash in a brutal conflict that solidified Cold War divisions in Asia. The Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, became a bloody proxy war, with the U.S. fighting to contain communism while the Soviets backed the North. Finally, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 sparked a decade-long conflict, with the U.S. arming Afghan rebels to counter Soviet influence. These hotspots weren't just locations. They were powder kegs that defined the Cold War's global struggle. The Cold War erupted from a perfect storm of post-World War II tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. After their wartime alliance crumbled, their clashing ideologies, capitalist democracy versus communist control, fueled deep mistrust. The Soviets expanded their influence by installing communist regimes in Eastern Europe, sparking fears of a global red wave. The nuclear arms race escalated when both superpowers tested atomic bombs, turning the world into a high-stakes game of brinkmanship. Disagreements over Germany's future, whether it would be democratic or under Soviet control, added fuel to the fire. Meanwhile, the U.S., terrified of communism's spread, launched efforts like the Marshall Plan to contain it. These factors combined to create a decades-long standoff that defined the 20th century. the world dodged nuclear annihilation through a mix of diplomacy, strategy, and sheer luck. Diplomatic communication, like the Washington-Moscow hotline, helped prevent misunderstandings during crises, while arms control treaties such as the NPT and INF reduced nuclear stockpiles. The chilling logic of mutual assured destruction kept both sides in check, knowing a first strike would mean mutual doom. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, leaders like Kennedy and Khrushchev chose dialogue over destruction, averting disaster. Close calls, like false alarms, were defused by cool-headed individuals like Soviet officer Vasily Arkhipov, who refused to launch nukes under pressure. Meanwhile, public activism against nuclear weapons pushed governments to prioritize peace over escalation. Together, these factors turned the tide against a nuclear nightmare. The Cold War's shadow looms large over modern geopolitics, shaping the world in profound ways. It birthed enduring military alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact, which still influence global security. The US-Soviet rivalry divided nations into ideological camps, a legacy that continues to define international relationships. The nuclear arms race sparked proliferation, with countries like North Korea and Iran pursuing their own atomic ambitions. Proxy wars in Vietnam, Korea, and Afghanistan left scars that fuel conflicts to this day. The ideological clash between capitalism and communism still echoes in political systems worldwide, while international bodies like the United Nations emerge to mediate global tensions. From alliances to ideologies, Cold War's fingerprints are everywhere.